we're so excited that you were able to join us again for our discussion on power, money, and sex. This week, we get a chance to peek into this living room discussion as we just have a girlfriend conversation about sex. Stay tuned. Okay, let's get started. I wanted to start the conversation just with just the question of when we say the word sex, what things come into your mind? Just that one word. What do you think about when you think about that word, sex?
For me, it's intimacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anybody else?
For me, I would say marriage. Sex was created for marriage.
Okay.
2 words, marriage and socialism. It's very socialized
Okay.
on the media.
2 words, and I'm single, so waiting patiently.
Okay.
Excitement, and I'm single as well. So
Yeah.
future excitement.
Good. I would say passion. No, I say passion. I'd say passion and intimacy and knowing would be something I would say. Let's talk a little bit about what it was like growing up in your household. Was sex something that was talked about? Was it one of those things where nobody talked about sex? Or how did you end up learning about sex? Was it from your classmates or your parents? Or what was your experience like? Anybody?
So for me, my mother started talking to me about sex when I was 4. So I came home with the question, where do babies come from? So she then promptly went out and got a book, Where Do Babies Come From? And at the age of 4, she started talking to me about sex. Now, it's interesting because my grandmother was like, oh my God, you're going to send that baby to hell. You can't give her that book. It's about, sex and that kind of stuff. But at the age of 4, my mother started talking to me about sex because I had the question about where do babies come from.
That's good.
Yeah.
I think in my house, if you talked about sex, you had to say it like this. And I was the youngest of 4 siblings, so starting to see my older sisters date and those kind of things. At first, that issue wasn't a concern to me, but as they got older, just kind of began to wonder from there, and then talking to my mom about it eventually. I think she initiated the conversation when she thought that I might be thinking about that.
Tell me a little bit about you.
Well, I've been married 27 years, and my husband Brady and I dated 9 years before we got married. So we met at 15, and then shortly after college we got married.
For me, my earliest memory of the sex talk was when my mom and my dad called my brother, sister, and I into a room to explain the birds and the bees, as well as show us, if we think we're grown, things that we need to things we need to know. And so I was the youngest of 3. So it was already embarrassing just to have my dad there. My mom, not so much. I guess for my brother, it was probably embarrassing to have my mom there. And then she also bought tools to show us in regards to using contraceptions and everything and what you're supposed to do. And then they told us, if we felt like we didn't want to follow their rules or we thought we were grown, if we make grown decisions, we have grown consequences too. So that was my earliest memory of the sex talk.
And at home, I never heard about sex. I'm a widow, being married 35 years. Growing up with my late husband, I was 19 and he was 26. I didn't know anything about sex. At 11 years old, and it was not a topic that you could talk to my mother about. She was very Catholic, never wore pants. She was, although she did have 14 children. So we used to goof on her. We used to laugh at her, and we used to say, Mom, you guys never had a TV? And she used to turn beet red, but it was not discussed. As a matter of fact, even when I was 11 years old, and my mother started talking about when I become a teenager or whatever, but there was no details. So when I was 11 years old and I got my menstruation on a trip with my best friend on the same day, I thought I was dying. We never knew. I mean, the teacher started screaming. She didn't know what to do. And when we came home, my mother still was afraid to, and I didn't ask any questions. Sex was not a topic that was discussed at home.
Well, in my household, growing up in a pastor's house, the second of 4 children, it was not discussed. And I don't ever really recall having the conversation. However, I have a sister that I am 13 years older than. And when my parents told us that we were having a baby sister, we were like, really? Y'all have sex for real? so she came from somewhere. And my parents were so embarrassed. You can see the look on your face. But growing up in a pastor's house, that's just not something we really talked about. No more than the consequences. So that was the conversation that we would have, the consequences of what sex outside of marriage would be. So it was constantly drilled, marriage. So that's the way it was presented to us until the ripe old age of 13, and then probably more conversation was held because we asked questions. Before, we were too afraid to ask questions. So after that, we would ask questions, and my mother would answer the questions if we asked.
And tell me a little bit about your background.
I am divorced. I was married for 15 years. And my husband and I got divorced in 2010.
My experience of learning about sex in my household was just a little different. My mother was a biology teacher, so it was a little over the top, if you ask me. And when I say over the top, I really do mean over the top. It was the kind of setting where I came home and she says, you know, my brother is 6 years younger, so this conversation was just for me. And she had a video. And at that time, there wasn't video. It's a little reel-to-reel thing that was showing up on the basic wall,
yes.
with this whole sex education series that she was taking me through. So needless to say, it was always talked about in our home, and it was talked about in a very open way. My mother made it so that I could feel comfortable talking to her, which was always a little weird, but it was a very open discussion, and it was layered. So, you know, it started, you know, when I was younger, but as I became a teenager, it became a little more and a little more and a little more. So, and it was a conversation, and I think about it now. I have my best friend. Sometimes my mom would say things, and my best friend would just go, I can't believe she's saying this. And I was like, you're married. What are you doing? What's the big deal? You know, but I realized that that's not everybody's experience. So I think it kind of shadows or changes how we view ourselves and how we handle our relationships. And I began to think about society a little bit. And I think we are now living in a time where what used to be too much is now a little. I think television and movies and magazines have just taken sex to an entirely different level. What effect do you think this is having on our society when we think about what you can see on television now compared to when you couldn't see? I used to sneak and watch Benny Hill, thinking that was, you know, really something terrible. But now that is like a cartoon compared to the stuff kids watch.
That's true.
Well, for me, I have a 13-year-old cousin that lives here, and so we spend a lot of time together. And so I watch the same things that she watches, and she likes the Disney Channel. Now she's venturing out. But even in those channels where you thought, okay, it's a kids channel, they're not going to be addressing certain things, they are. And so then I have to sit down and talk to her and reinforce, you know, what my aunt and my uncle, you know, the standards, and kind of we talk about, we have an open dialogue, but I make sure to always keep it open, because the things that she's exposed to at her age, I probably wasn't exposed to until much older. And so the effects, I said it was hard for me, you know, when you're saying not to have sex till marriage, and everyone when you get into high school, then college, and on, so I can't even imagine. She's in middle school, and all of the things that she already knows just from what her friends tell her and from what she sees on TV.
I think it makes sex seem so very commonplace. You know, when I think about just even some of the commercials. I have a son who's 12, and you know, I can be watching something on TV, comes in the room, and the Victoria's Secret commercial comes on, and I'm like, well, that's kind of in your face, you know, at that moment. So it can, you know, desensitize young people about what's appropriate, and I think it can make something that's meant to be sacred very commonplace.
And just to add to what Joy was saying, I noticed too a lot, and I love to watch Scandal, but I noticed too a lot that there's no, it's commonplace in the sense that you don't have to be married in a relationship and love someone. You know, anybody is free, is fair game, and you can be with anybody. It's okay because you're just having sex. So that has changed a lot because TV didn't used to be that way. You know, it was marriage and it was a couple, and it was a very clear line between singles and marriage having sex.
And these days, I'm with Joy about the commercials. They're so sexist. Even the simplest thing that they're advertising, it's all about sex. Even when they, like, let's say somebody's advertising even a lipstick. You know, it's also so sexist these days that even when the children are watching TV and the commercials come on, sometimes you want to cringe. Like you want to flip the channel, but then they're watching the show, so you just don't know what to do. And you can't prevent everything from them seeing everything. Because then when they're not near you, they're going to want to watch it. So you really do have to talk to your children. When I was a young mom, I had my first child at 17, and I was determined that my daughter, as soon as she hit 6 years old, I started talking to her about the birds and the bees. And my late husband used to say, don't you think she's too young? I said, she's never too young. I said, because it's not going to happen to her what happened to me. And I'll tell you, my daughter had a child at 33. One had a child at 33 and the other one at 30, because I always said, get a life before you give a life. So you really have to protect the children from the TV and everything that's going on.
Well, we have come a far cry from the Dick Van Dyke Show and when you used to see the two beds in the room when they would show that. I mean, now it's just so socialized. And everything, social media, television, videos, I mean, everything. They're selling sex. And so I think that's what makes the difference. And our children are desensitized to it. So unless they are hearing that message at home, the importance and the value that God places on it, what they see on television is too much.
That's right. That's right.
I have nieces and nephews that I spend a great deal of time with and refer to them as my babies. And there's nothing taboo, so they know they can call me. You know, we didn't grow up that way, but I want to make sure that they have that information, even to the point where there have been times when my sisters call me, she's like, okay, this one is yours, and she'll hand them the phone.
It's on you this time.
That's good.
We call that co-parenting.
As in Colleen.
There you go. With Auntie Co. So there are questions, and I don't have a problem with answering the questions because if they don't get it from us or their parents, then they're going to get it from the streets.
Yeah, absolutely.
And my nephew comes up with some very creative questions at the age of 12. You wouldn't think that he should know.
Right. Yeah. They're exposed to so much. And even the Disney Channel. I mean, I spend so much time unpacking the Disney Channel. I think there is a tendency now for sex just to be something that people do. It's not attached to a commitment. It's not attached to a marriage. And I find that I struggle to find TV shows that have healthy marriages. If you really begin to think about all the shows that are on television, what shows have healthy marriages? There's so few that you can begin to think of. I can only think of one. But I cringe because even taking my 15-year-old to a PG-13 movie, I sat there the whole time like, oh no. you can't watch this part. It's like, this is a little too much. And this was
That's true.
PG-13. And
That's
in my
true.
mind, it really should have been R. So, but
That's
what,
true.
as we think about this, for us as women, whether we're single, married, divorced, widowed, what impact does it have on how we view sexuality? And as we begin to think about sex, I think about, are we allowing ourselves to see these things and have an impact on our lives? So are we thinking that our lives should be like Scandal? Our lives should be like some of the things that we see? Are we allowing ourselves to read things that take our minds to places we don't need to go? 50 Shades of Grey. No, the craze is out there, and women are into these things, but what is it that women are really seeking? What do you think?
I'll say, for me, I don't entertain it because I know me. So I don't entertain it. Now, I was married for 15 years. My husband, ex-husband, is the only man I've ever been with. And that's an anomaly, I think, in this day and time. And so sometimes when I have the opportunity to talk to young girls and young women, and I say that to them, you should see the expression. They're like, oh, wow. And at one point, I used to sort of be embarrassed about saying that, but not anymore, because really it's something, it's very rare that I hear people in my age group, 47 years old, not married, don't have any children. I always heard my father's voice saying, God will keep those who want to be kept. And so that was one of the things that just was hammered. And I found myself in situations, sometimes of my own doing, sometimes not of my own doing, where I heard his voice, God would keep those who want to be kept. I'm like, well, do I want to be kept or not? And that's just being honest.
Absolutely.
But thank the Lord, that's where my mindset was, and the Lord always allowed me to, you know, not find myself in that situation. So of course that was in my younger years, and now being mature enough to know not to even put myself in situations like that. So I don't find myself in those situations. And should I get married again? I think it's something that should be sacred, and I want it to be all that God intended it to be. So.
Yeah. When God created sex, he knew what he was doing.
Oh, yes, he did.
You know, the idea of it being between a man and a woman for a committed relationship and
That's
a
right.
marriage.
That's right.
Because I think that when we experience it before we have that marriage relationship, the level of intimacy is not the same. And then we allow ourselves to be vulnerable to things God never intended for us to be vulnerable to.
That's true.
So the whole idea of sex being for marriage and for that experience is because it's a beautiful thing. Now, this is going to lead me into this discussion of, you know, we grow up and we hear no, you know, save it for marriage. We hear it over and over again. This is not something you do. It's supposed to be, you know, either sex is not to be done or sex is nasty or all these things about sex that's a no, a not, a not. And then you get married and it's like, okay, now sex is fine. It's like, did sex change? What is that about, you know? And how are we as married women? I've been married, it'll be 21 years on the 27th of November. Are we supposed to have this little switch that goes from, okay, I'm excited and I'm waiting, to, okay, this day is here, and now in one day I'm supposed to now unleash and be uninhibited without having to hold myself all this time? You know, how does that happen? I know for the married women, what kind of change, or how do you adjust to that?
I think for me, and as I was hearing Colleen talk, I remember growing up and kind of feeling social boundaries to sex, and that, you know, good girls don't do that.
Right.
Or if you do, don't let anybody know that you're doing that. And then it was introduced to me the spiritual boundaries when I was in college and involved with a campus ministry. And it was basically that the physical relationship should never exceed the spiritual commitment. And so for me at that time, you know, not being married but dating who would be my future husband, at the time, there was a girl in the ministry that was kind of my accountability partner, and sometimes I didn't want to be held accountable. But I think that for me, once I got married, I had been dating my husband, well, at that time my boyfriend, for 9 years. So I was just welcoming the freedom and the liberty for that weight to be lifted, of not having to battle any feelings of, whether it was feelings of guilt of thinking about it or considering it, or just knowing now that I had a license to drive.
Right.
You know, it's like, you know, so, you know, I remember someone giving the analogy that if you don't have a license, you shouldn't be messing with the headlights and sitting behind the steering wheel and all that, you know. It's like, well, now I can get in the car and do a road trip. So that was, it was very liberating, you know, getting married. I looked forward to that, got the shackles gone.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for me, I have to say, like I shared before, I had a child at 17. It was just sex. There was no pleasure in it. It was really just sex. I was scared, but I still did it. I was naive. I didn't know any better. And I said that my mother was old-fashioned. Well, so am I. I've had 2 boyfriends, and I have 2 daughters. My husband, my late husband, was my second boyfriend. So it didn't take me long to be with somebody for that amount of time, because I knew that he was the one, and the sex part was so different. I was like, what is that? Compared to my older daughter's father, it was just sex. But with my late husband, there was so much more to it than just sex. There was love, there was unselfness. He was considerate. He made sure that I was happy doing it. You know what I mean? As compared to before, where I was scared and I did it anyway. So there was a commitment. There was an intimacy. There was love. And it was so different. And it was truly a marriage with good sex before BC, and it was better after Christ. It got better after Christ because God was in the picture. And everything we do it unto the Lord, right? Including sex. So when you feel the presence of God in your marriage and in your sex life, it's just, and you know that God ordained it for you with this person, it is so much better. It pays to wait on God for your love partner. Because why in the world would God give you someone, if he loves you unconditionally, why would he give you someone who's going to love you any less? So it pays to wait on God for your love partner.
Yeah. That freedom in the marriage experience allows you to have a connection that when we talk about that they may be one, you know, that you become as one, there's nothing that can compare to that experience of that oneness, of being one with someone else and knowing that it is a spiritual connection.
Yes.
More so than it is a physical connection.
Yes.
And that for the world to kind of take that is the enemy's way of cheapening it or taking it away. And so, you know, that whole switching our minds to kind of get there, for me, it took a minute for my mind to begin to shift from no to yes, you know, or feeling guilt to feeling like, okay, I shouldn't feel guilty about this because this is my spouse. You know, almost to the question, you know, in my mind was, is it lusting if I feel this way about my husband? You know? I was like, really, is that? No, it's not. But those kinds of questions, I think, and those experiences, as we go from singleness to being a happily married, fulfilled person, are very valid discussions to have.
And I would, to piggyback on what you're saying, guilt, that was the word for me. Because coming out of my dad's house and then going to my husband, that was so much guilt. It was crazy. Until I read a book one day that said women and sex, God's something, intimate issues. And my husband's like, oh, well, what happened to you? I said, I read a book. But in that book, it actually talked about Christian, growing up in a Christian household. Somebody had recommended the book to me. Growing up in a Christian household and how you feel when you get married, crossing over into being married, and not really having those in-depth conversations with your parents. It was a great book. I actually still have the book.
Okay, well, you have to share.
But it just broke so many chains as far as that goes, and that took a good probably 8 months into our marriage, 8 months to a year, before I would say I was really comfortable. And then my husband thought I was a crazy woman. But
he was happy.
But that's the difference. That's the difference. Guilt,
Yes.
I think, is a big word. That transition.
Yeah, I think guilt is a big thing. I mean, even as a single person, you know, your thoughts and ideas about sexuality and being able to try to restrain yourself. And I've heard you talk some about having an accountability partner. Stephanie, you talk a little bit about what is that like?
Well, it's funny because I'm dating. And
Okay.
so I have an accountability partner, which we've been friends since freshman year of college. And so we were talking one day about, you know, the boundaries in which my boyfriend and I have set. And for the first time, she said, well, you're grown now. You know, no one needs to know your business. Who cares about this, this, and this? And the mindset in which we both made the pact together, we've always kept each other accountable. And it's not because of what other people said, but it was, you know, because of what God said.
Yes.
And it was about, you know, honoring God and being pure in his eyes. And I remember that almost like, for a second, I was like, wait, like, who are you? And now what's going on in your life, too. But, and then it made me, though, make that decision of, okay, you got to do this for yourself. And now, you know, of course, my parents and his parents keep us accountable and stuff like that. But it's also about what we watch. Like I don't watch certain things, even though I am old enough to see certain movies. I don't, because to me, it makes my mind wander.
Right.
And I know the more my mind starts wandering, the more curious, and I just don't want to open that door, that Pandora's box. And it's one of those things where, you know, you pray constantly because it's like, you're not married yet. You lasted all this time, but what people don't realize is you still have the same temptations.
Right.
It doesn't go away. In fact, sometimes it gets stronger, especially when you're in a relationship. It's a lot harder. And people are like, oh, you waited this long, you got this. And I'm like, it's a day by day, prayer by prayer, you know, and it's both of us. And that was one of the things that I did pray for, because I've been in relationships where it was me and it was like, oh, well, because you are, I am. And there was no commitment in which they had made to God. And then it turned sour really quick. And so those type of things were, I never thought I would be having to wait this long. So that was the other thing of, God, what's going on? And it was but why are you waiting? And that's where I had to come to. I had to move beyond, because of what other people told me about the fear and it may hurt. I had to move beyond because, you know, this is what mom and dad told you you had to do. And it wasn't until I understood what the purpose of, you know, of sex and marriage and the protections and the covering that's happening behind it and the baggage that I didn't want to have to bring into the marriage and then have to deal with, you know, through the marriage. It was when I got to that point was when it was like, okay, I'm willing to give up the books. I'm willing to give up the conversations with certain people, and even to give up the TV shows that they're so popular and everyone talks about them, and I'm just like, I just sit there because I have no idea what they're talking about, and I don't want to, just for that. And so it's and some people are like, it doesn't take all of that, but for me it does. And that's the thing.
Yeah, there's a scripture that says everything may be permissible, but it is not, what is it?
Lawful.
Lawful.
Yeah.
So that, you know, there are lots of things that are legal that we could do, but they may not be what we can do in order to maintain the life that God wants us to have.
Right.
And I think that's an excellent point. Another thing I think that you said, Stephanie, is that it's one thing to say you're going to be celibate when you don't have a man.
Yes.
That's
But
right.
when you do have a man,
Yes.
it's a whole different mindset of making sure that you're able to maintain, and you're right, unless two people, because I've been in relationships where one person is and the other person isn't, and then it becomes a challenge to make you give up what you decided that you are going to keep.
Right.
And that constant friction is never good. But the other thing I have found is that in relationships where two people are committed to be celibate, that both people have weak moments, but not at the same time.
Right.
And God is so good that way.
Yes.
So
That's
that,
true.
you know, because both people are committed, you know, when I was having a weak moment, it'd be like, you know, to pull us, reel us back in, and
That's
vice
right.
versa.
That's right.
So that the ability to keep that commitment before God. But what you said about it's worth it, and what you're waiting for, and why you're waiting for it, gives you a whole different perspective. A whole different perspective. Yeah. I was reading something that talked about how, imagine that your virginity or your waiting for marriage is like a Christmas present, and that if you sneak and open it up before and you try to rewrap it and stick it back up under the tree,
It's definitely not the same.
definitely not the same. Definitely not the same.
And you're
Definitely.
not as happy when you see it the next time. So, picture yourself unwrapping that gift again, and nobody knows that you already opened it.
Right.
It's like you have to pretend, so don't lie. You have to pretend that you're really excited to see that. No, you're not. 'Cause you already tried it, and it was okay because you weren't supposed to.
Right. So that's a whole different conversation, I think,
Yes.
of how we how do people come back from that? Because I think for a lot of people, the experience is getting married. I was not a virgin. I had some crazy periods in my life, and luckily, you know, God was able to catch me and allow me to get to a different part of my relationship with Him, and allow me to see that who I wasn't defined by who I was attached to. And because of that, I made some different choices and decided that I would be celibate and that I would wait now for what God had for me. And I think people need to know you can get a second chance at it. You know, even though you may have messed it up, that when God desires for you to set you apart, to make that commitment again, that you're able to do that. Any comments on that?
Yes, so I've been celibate for almost 10 years. And I would agree with everything that you were saying about, you know, God just one day, I remember I was going to somebody's house, you know, and God just showed me, you're more important than that. You're more important than what you're going to go there to do. I have better things for you. And I know it's not this way for everybody, but for me, it was done. It was cut off. Now that does not mean I don't have urges.
Right.
Oh, I have urges. I have burning urges. And now my urges have switched into wanting to be married to my husband and be with him and then have children. So then I'm praying through that, and I have a mentor that I call and we talk through that whole situation. But as far as the need for the instant gratification, prayer, supplication, and God He released me from it. And now I see it as so much more, and even so much more to the point that I look at friends that I have and I start to think about, okay, well, what if that would have been me with those kids, having 3 or 4 kids? Because, I mean, that was grace and mercy. So I'm like, well, thank you, God, for grace and mercy, because I could have had 5, you know, and been single and not been married. So if you pray about it, and I definitely say having the accountability partner, God can release you and He can show you that you're worth so much more.
That's true. Let's talk about being worth something. Because as we get into the scriptures, I think one of the studies that we're going to look at will be the study dealing with Leah and Rachel. And of course, you know, Leah was the weak-eyed sister, and Rachel was the pretty one. Of course, Leah was the oldest, and Rachel was the youngest. And so, of course, Laban ended up tricking Jacob and giving him the oldest sister first. And so he wakes up and finds he's got the one with the weak eyes,
Right.
and that's not what he wanted, but he's already slept with her.
Yes.
Okay, so now he marries Rachel, and he loves Rachel more than he loves Leah. So that whole experience for Leah was, maybe I should have a baby in order to get him to love me. We see that in society now, when women do things to try to gain a man's affection. The saying is, women use sex in order to get love, and men say they love you in order to get some sex. What are your thoughts about that, and that whole idea of wanting to do something in order to gain a person's love through either sex or material things?
I think that it's just that longing for tremendous affirmation from, you know, obviously for a woman from a man. And I remember in one of our previous studies, I think it was I'm Not Good Enough, Other Lies Women Tell Themselves. Sharon James says that a really, really good husband still makes a very poor God. And the same is true about a really, really, really good boyfriend, because I've had them both, and he was the same person, Brady. But a really, really, really good boyfriend still makes a very, very poor God. And the kind of craving that we have and longing for that kind of affirmation only comes from God. And then within the marriage covenant, it comes from a man who knows God and able to then show you that kind of love. But I think that it's easy to get it twisted. You know, I remember even as a teenager, and then looking back in retrospect, I had an idol called romance. And whatever we worship, you know, we literally bow before that thing. We really are trying to appease it.
That's true.
And, you know, so we have to really check what we're embracing in the deepest part of ourselves. If it's really a desire to just be loved, or is it really a desire to know the God who is love? And depending on what the answer is, that determines, I think, what we're willing to do to have that need met.
That's true. And also, when you're looking for your self-worth in people and things, you will still have that void that only God can fill. Because I remember, even when I became a Christian, in '97, and my husband came in 2 years later, he became a Christian too. He was still my big security blanket. Like I said, I was 19 and he was 26. He was much older, smarter, wise man, wise man. I learned so much from him. I always tell, because my older daughter was a year and a half when I met him. And I always tell him, you're raising the two of us together. But you know, I used to joke like that, but it was the God honest truth. Because my husband was such a big security blanket. He had the job, and he had this, and he had that. And I learned so much from him that I didn't learn at home with my dysfunctional family and everybody going buck wild sometimes. But in that, when I didn't find God, he found me. When God found me and I felt like I could have a voice, like I could be myself, I just started liking myself. Even though I didn't like myself before that. I didn't like that I had to depend on my husband, and I would make decisions, but I always second guessed myself. You know, I doubted myself. That's what's wrong with your self-worth and finding value in anything other than God, because our value and our self-worth and our identity should be in Christ alone. Should be in Christ alone. And then that's the freedom that we found we have when who the Son sets free is free indeed.
It's free indeed. It's free indeed. It's good. It's good. Anything else?
I just have one more comment.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the first question about when you first learned about sex. So I would say, just to add to that, that learning who you are in Christ, especially for those of you who have children, it's really starting with that young person at that young age. Because I can remember, yes, at 4, my mother talked to me about sex, but sex was, and I think Colleen or somebody said this, a means to an end. Like, I learned about where babies come from and not to get pregnant, but not the self-worth of being in the covenant of a marriage and learning my self-worth. So, you know, you can play back things about I shouldn't have did this or I shouldn't have been there, but it was I didn't know my self-worth. And now that I know my self-worth in Christ, I can wait.
Right, right.
And I think that's even important, even if you don't go all the way, but the essence of you going further than what you wanted to. So I know for me, it was like that was, you know, the point that I didn't do, but I did so much more leading up to that I didn't want to, for the whole essence of, you know, the self-worth of, well, he knows that I'm not going to put out, so you have to do something. And it was that that mindset of, you know, okay, I may not do this, but what else can I do to compensate without realizing you don't need to compensate. You know, that you as is, you know, what your limits are, because at the end of the day, if you left feeling guilty, it was wrong.
Right.
That's right.
You know,
Absolutely.
it was wrong. And it took me, you know, once I started knowing my self-worth in God, that's when I really started knowing that was still wrong. That was still out of his will. You weren't supposed to do it. You ain't all clean and everything. No, you got your issues. And it was then when I also was bold enough to say, you take me or leave me. And my boyfriend that I'm dating now is funny too, because he was just getting to the point of like, God, am I ever gonna find that right girl? And so one of the things when he first met me, and we talked about, you know, sex, it was like, well, not only that, I don't do this, and this. As a single person. As a sex, but those are also as a single person, he was just like, you were just so secure, you know. And I said, you know, marriage is different, but as a single person, doing these things made me feel guilty.
Right.
And for him, his prayer was for a virtuous woman, and he was just like, that was just confirmation for me that in dating you was the right choice, and that we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that, because I thought at that point he was like, this girl done lost her mind. she done got a list. And she broke out the list and told me what she ain't gonna do. And I was so afraid in doing it, but I said, you know what, been there, done that, I'm not going back, and God, I'm okay. I like myself. So, you know, so if that ain't it, you know, it's okay. The next one will come.
Next.
Yes.
Exactly. That's good. That's good.
I think that's a great point, because I mean, I think I'm a tad bit older than you. But I really did. I got to that point and said, well, God will honor the decisions that I've made. And I truly do believe that he will honor that. And even though I have had people that I've dated in the past, still when I tell them, when we have that conversation, you could kind of see the beeline for the door to some degree, or after that.
Right.
And I don't have a problem with that. And we can still talk and be friends or whatever. But I don't have a problem with that. But I have so many people say to me, I've had several people say to me, Colleen, you are really marriage material. And I was to ask me, what does that mean? And so they would go down a list of what that means. So you can go and do something somewhere else, but you want to come home to somebody like me. And that's the difference.
Right.
And I'm okay with you going, but you can't come back to me. That's the point, and that's just not going to happen. But if you know that, because I tell people that up front, they're like, wow, you know, you're marriage material. I'm not ready for that yet, but you're marriage material. And I appreciate that people recognize that. And I think because of my age, it really doesn't matter to me. I don't have a problem. Because my self-esteem is such that it's not an issue for me. That's not an issue for me. Now, I might have some other issues.
We all got issues.
That'll be the
I may
next
have
one.
some other ones. That's a different panel discussion.
Yeah.
But this particular one is not, because I have settled it,
Right.
in my spirit, and I just believe that God is going to honor the choices that I've made because of that. Because I realize that I am an anomaly.
Yeah.
Very few 47-year-olds probably could say they've only had sex with their husband. Not to say that a lot of people haven't, but I'm just saying it's not normal today in the way people look at things.
Yeah. A couple things jump out at me, and one is there was a sermon that co-pastor Susie Owens did that talked about the jewelry in the jewelry store, and how you talk about how you're an anomaly, how you're different. I think that when God sets you apart, you're not going to be in the display case, you know, because if you want the expensive jewelry, they have to bring it back. They got to go to the back, right? So it's not something that's always up front. It's not what everybody is gazing at in the case. It's something that they've got to go back and they've got to pull from behind. So you know, don't feel as a single person that's strange. It's okay. You are peculiar. Nation. Okay, God has set you apart, and the word says, "He that findeth a wife." It doesn't say he that finds a girl or a woman. In other words, you become a wife before you become a wife.
That's right.
Okay, so that you're found as a wife, not just as a woman. You know, that's it.
And Lady Kim, God fills that void, because I'll never forget after my husband passed away, and you're having sex for 35 years. You hear me?
Right. I've been waiting to hear this. I don't know.
You got my attention.
I'm so glad that we're laughing about that. So here I am. I was like, well, that's it? Absolutely. And I didn't even have to think about it. This is me asking me. I wasn't even asking God. You know, the great thing, I was going to say the good thing, the great thing is that we had 35 years of good sex. It got gooder, whether that's a word or not. It got gooder with God. It got gooder with God. But here I am, I'm mourning my husband, I'm grieving, I'm not thinking about sex. I mean, the sex stopped a month after his first chemo. So it's going to be almost 4 years that I'm celibate. So one day I'm in church about a month after he passed away, and I was sobbing. So I'm here with my best friend Doris Wilson. So something that was sung, the song, or something that was said, I said, Doris. And I wasn't even talking about sex, but the words that she said filled everything that I needed to hear. It was everything I needed to hear, because she's also a widow. So I said, Doris, I said, well, what happens now? That's it? That's it? And I was sobbing. She said, Elizabeth, God fills every single void that Harold was in.
My Lord.
Every single void. And it pierced my soul, not just my spirit. It pierced my soul. So for us, when it says seek first the kingdom of God, it's in every area. Financially, emotionally, mentally, sexually, physically. It's every area. When she said those words, that was just that line. It's like it saved my soul again, you know? Elizabeth, God will fill every void that Harold was in. That's all I needed to hear. I had peace. I really did.
He fills every void, even you know, not even in that situation, in a single situation, in
he
every
fills every
situation.
void.
That's just
You know,
that's healing.
it's a different situation, but for the first 10 years of my marriage, we were in the Marine Corps, so my husband was gone a lot. And our first year of marriage, he was gone 6 months. He only came back on our first anniversary. But, you know, what you're saying is that, you know, and I'm thinking about perhaps women who may watch this video and their husbands are traveling a lot, or, you know, they may be military spouses even, or know someone who is. And God is faithful, you know, to do that. And it's obviously a very different situation than being widowed, but just having to be alone and separated from your husband because of distance. You know, it's just amazing what God does. And I've seen him during that time just really not only keep that marital fire burning, but really allow there to be a fresh thing when there is the reunion in those cases. And just the blessing of knowing that you both been faithful in the midst of that. Because certainly in the military lifestyle, there was a lot of other things going on in the midst of deployment. And so there was a ministry in and of itself. But as you were mentioning that, you know, I know people who long for their spouses because they're away for obviously different circumstances, but God is faithful in every circumstance.
Yes. He is. He is. I want to share one thing quickly related to that, because it's almost time for us to wrap up. But this helped me as a newly married person, having been celibate with my spouse before marriage. It was the thought that if I was able to maintain myself in singleness before I was married, then in my marriage, when temptation comes, my confidence and assurance of knowing that I can and that he has the ability to do that is there, creates a comfort when my husband is traveling. Because if you can keep yourself for somebody you really want, then your ability to keep yourself from somebody that's just anybody is a little different. So keeping ourselves, it serves a lot of a purpose other than just, you know, that waiting period. Is also building a level of trust that's going to be seen later in marriage. In a way that you would not have for the person who ended up with somebody's spouse because they were married and now sleeping with their husband, and then so the trust is not the same as opposed to when you're able to allow yourself to withhold and sacrifice and wait for the best, because the best is yet to come.
Yes, it is.
Yes. And as we close, I'm gonna close on this one comment. I hear single women say all the time, we are so we just can't wait. We're so excited about the fact that one day we'll be able to have sex. And then some of them say to me, but why is it when we talk to married women, all they do is complain about sex? I was like, what is that about? And I was like, I don't know. What is that about?
You know, they talking to the wrong married women.
That's right. That's good, Joy. That's good.
That is it. That is absolutely it. I think that as we work forward from where we are, knowing that God is able to keep us in whatever state we're in, and allow God in the marriage moment to continue year after year to take you to new levels of intimacy, to new levels of knowing, because the Bible says that Adam knew Eve, and I love that, because that's not just sex. Okay, to know someone means to really, in an intimate way, connect to who they really are, not just who you see they are, but who they are on the inside. And it's allowing ourselves to be open as women to receive our spouses in a marriage way. So I think it's important as we raise our children to teach both sides of what sex is about. So even though we say no, we need to also say sex is a wonderful thing, that it's been created by God, that he designed it for a married relationship between a man and a woman, and what his plan is great. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation on sex. But if you get a chance, click onto the blog and do the lessons, because there's so much more for you to learn as we talk about power, money, and sex God's way. Be blessed.